Welcome to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer, brought to you by the World Puja Network. My name is Dr. Stephen Greer, and I'm the director and founder of the Orion Project and the Disclosure Project. And I am joined by Dr. Ted Loder, who is our senior scientist on the projects, and we will be discussing today the suppression of new energy and why we're still using oil and coal in the world 100 years after the solutions to replace them were discovered. And that will be our focus today on the World Puja Network, and also what the solutions are and what we can do about it. So I'd like to thank you, Ted, for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Great. So I think in a way of introduction, what many people don't understand is that we have not needed oil and gas and coal for over 100 years. In fact, if you go to the orionproject.org, you'll see that there's a picture up there with Nikola Tesla and a guy named Stubblefield who had invented what they called an earth battery back in 1902 and actually demonstrated it to Congress. And Dr. Loder and I actually saw a modern version of this made by a rather unschooled inventor on an island in the Caribbean back about 5 or 6 years ago. And what was astonishing is that when we saw this particular device, which through various intimidations and problems, this inventor never developed any further with to bring to the world, but we did go down and test this thing, and it basically had 6 stakes sitting in the ground and a wire coming from these stakes that were connected to a capacitor, and it was a homemade little sort of generator motor. And after he would manually turn it and get it running, it just took off, and you could plug into a power strip of fans and lights and a stereo and whatever you wanted to, and it was putting out several hundred watts of free power just from this resonant effect with these earth battery, this sort of field that was being created. And this sounds like magic. It isn't. It was done, I know, initially around the turn of the last century, around 1900, by Stubblefield and Nikola Tesla, and it actually got demonstrated to Congress. Now you have to ask the question then, why are we still getting half of our electric energy from burning coal and causing global warming and destroying the environment and paying these high costs? And the reason has very little to do with what's technically possible. It has to do with the money and power that's behind a centralized power system. So those are the sort of issues we're going to talk about today.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Well, Steve, Dr. Greer, you've said these technologies have been suppressed. Why is there a suppression of these energy technologies? The question I often get from so many people talking about this is they want to know, well, gee, if you have a better energy technology, why wouldn't you want to bring it out? That's really the nut of the issue, isn't it? Why is there suppression of these energy technologies?
Right, and the sort of easy answer that most people get to when they ask why would a big breakthrough like this be suppressed is that, oh, well, it has to do with all the money. But that's not really quite it. It misses it by sort of an order of magnitude, because what you're really talking about is something that J.P. Morgan was reported to have said to Nikola Tesla when Tesla had invented one of these free energy generators, and that is that he turned to Tesla and said, this isn't going to come out because we can't put a meter on it, and we can't therefore control it. And yes, that's partially a financial and moneyed interest, of course, but a larger part of it at this stage, when you're talking about a cabal, an interest group that has trillions of dollars already, it's not that they're for want of money. They have 747s with gold-plated everything and flying palaces or what have you. The issue really is how the world is run and who controls that. It's about geopolitical power, because if every home in America, but more importantly every home in India and China and Indonesia and South America had free energy from a device like we just described, say an earth battery or some solid-state electromagnetic generator like we have a team working on right now with the Orion Project.org, you would suddenly change the entire geopolitical climate so that those who are currently in the catbird seat, as it were, and calling the shots would have to put a seat at the geopolitical table for the rest of the world. And there's sort of a racist undertone to this, in my opinion. I think that many of the people who have had this sort of power really don't want to give it up, but also don't want to share it with parts of the world that up until now have been incredibly impoverished. You have, something like half of the world's population living on less than $2 a day. And if you had free energy through a simple device that wasn't very expensive to create, suddenly you would have all these impoverished areas of the world becoming very abundant and very prosperous with clean, non-polluting energy technology for not only their homes and vehicles, but also for manufacturing, for clean water, for organic agriculture. All of this would be possible, and the world would be transformed. But the centralized power grip, the chokehold of this group of 200 or 300 corporations and individuals and families that really are calling the shots, that would fall like sand through their fingers. And so I think in analyzing this and having personally met with members of royal families, very, very wealthy people who are part of this clique, if you want to call it that, or cabal, my opinion of it is that it's really more about they're afraid of losing control. They're afraid of losing the centralized control and power that they have, because bringing out these kinds of technologies really means the end of the geopolitical order we have today, where basically the Great White Father runs roughshod over the whole planet. You would have a world economy go from probably something around $30 trillion a year up to $100 trillion or $200 trillion, and it would really be the tide that would lift all ships. But at the same time, you would have this dispersal of this centralized clique of power, and that is what they've been fighting for at least 40 or 50 years, if not 100 years.
Wow, this means that it sounds to me from what you're saying, it's very counterintuitive, isn't it? And it's really not about money, which is what people always initially think it is about.
Well, money
really
to
about
human
control
head
and
is
power.
Like, are we going to have enough money to put our kids through college, or are we going to have enough money to pay the mortgage or pay the gas bill or whatever? Now that gas is $4 a gallon or $9 a gallon in the United Kingdom. I think that's how most people think of money. But I think if you're already sitting on trillions of dollars in assets, really what you're looking at is the trip that these guys get on about control and power. And that's really what it's about. And that's why we have had, for example, one of our Disclosure Project.org witnesses, he was an Air Force colonel, Charles Brown. He had invented a electrostatic system that you could put on your car that would increase the fuel economy 20 to 40% by putting this electrostatic humidified air into the combustion chamber. And it also greatly reduced pollution. Now, he developed this in the late 70s and early 80s. But then when he went to Washington and had it tested at the Department of Transportation. He had the EPA test it. I have all these reports. And what's interesting is that he started getting threats. He had his prototype stolen and sabotaged. He had a car that was running on this stolen. And he had bomb threats called into his hotel room the night before he was going to have meetings with a lot of automotive dealers to try to get this technology put on all the new big gas-guzzling cars in the early 80s so that they would be competitive with the Japanese cars that were coming out at the time. And this man is rock solid. He's not a conspiracy kook at all. And this was something that wasn't going to replace the internal combustion engine or make it run completely on water the way Stan Meyer's system worked, which you can see at the OrionProject.org. This was simply going to reduce the amount of gasoline used and greatly clean up the emissions coming out of the tailpipe. Well, what I call Murder Incorporated came after him like crazy. So what he told me was that he went through his whole life savings to do this and found out that his sort of naive thinking early on was that, gee, I've been really stumbled across something here, and the world's going to beat a path to my door. But unfortunately, before the world could find out about it, this Murder Incorporated beat a path to his door. And this is not an urban legend. This has happened thousands and thousands of times all over the world because of this special interest group that really doesn't want these clean energy and free energy technologies to come out.
So what you're saying is, in the case of Charles Brown, they actually use physical threats to at least his lab and his equipment and the financial threats. And so it seems to me any inventor who is faced with that and is probably barely either living on retirement money or a small salary is going to fold.
Well, that's what happened with him. And interestingly, it wasn't just that. I mean, this bomb threat that was called in was to his particular hotel room through the front desk of the hotel. Oh. And so this was very frightening, of course, for a man thinking he was doing something good for the world and even something patriotic for our country by getting us off of reducing our need of foreign oil. Because this was in the late 70s, early 80s, after the first oil shock of the 70s with the oil embargo, and he's a very patriotic World War II generation hero, and he really thought he was doing something wonderful, and he was. But what we have found is that, and this is exactly why the Orion Project.org is organizing inventors like this to be put under our security umbrella, and also to pull in people who are the good folks, I call them, who are in government and are in industry, who would like to see these solutions join us in a team to create a powerhouse, as it were, around these inventors so that these technologies, as they become more developed, will be protected so that we can protect these kinds of heroes like Charles Brown and Colonel Brown and also many other people like Stan Meyer, and protect them from this kind of unwarranted abuse of power and threat. And that's just one way that it's happened. You know, we have a man on our team that we've dealt with. Many people have heard of Dr. Tom Balone, and he worked at the patent office and saw these types of inventions being sequestered through the abuse of the patent law, Section 180 and 181 of Title 35. You can go look it up. That allows for a national security order to be given to seize any technology viewed to be of significance to the national security. But we have had people that we know, and Ted, you've met with someone up there near where you live in New Hampshire.
Absolutely.
Who recently had someone visit him saying, well, this is going to affect the economic security because this man was working on a technology that would get hydrogen and oxygen liberated very efficiently from water so that we could use water as a fuel source, even seawater or wastewater. And these people often will get a visit by some shadowy entity. But we know of cases where people have actually had their inventions seized and suppressed. So there's a very large system out there, and this is not an urban legend or some sort of theory that exists. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to compensate for that? And that's where the expertise of the disclosureproject.org comes into place, where we were able to get 110 of these military and CIA and corporate witnesses to secret projects connected to UFOs to come forward and to do so safely and to do so in a protective manner. And, as of this date, we're talking now 7 years later, none of these men and women have ever been threatened. No one even got a phone call telling them to be quiet because we knew how to put together the security apparatus and the protective umbrella around them. And we're doing the same thing now for these new energy researchers. And we think that's what's essential, is that you have to have this part of it factored into your strategy. You have to have the security and involve the public. You have to involve millions of people like those who are listening to the World Puja Network to learn about this and to say, we are not going to allow another Colonel Brown's technology to wither on the vine and die because a bunch of petro-Nazis want to stop the world from having it. And I think it's going to take a lot of people standing up and saying enough is already. We want this technology out, and we want to fix the energy problem and create a sustainable civilization on this on this planet that isn't cannibalizing the planet in order to live in any kind of modern fashion.
So once again, it's to the average person, this is counterintuitive, isn't it? About what's happening in terms of the suppression and techniques that are used. Normal people, as we said earlier, think that that government, quote, would want this information out and available to the people to solve our energy problem, which even our president has said we have, and yet we found these shadowy organizations, which it's very interesting. People very often call to say, well, the government is doing this, the government is doing that. Well, in some cases it is, but it's very often, as I understand it, select pieces of the government who work independently of the elected government to keep this stuff under wraps. And I read recently a long list of the various techniques that they have used, not only what they used, for example, with Charles Brown and the threats and what have you to his lab, but very often, I'll just run through a couple of these.
Yeah, that'd be great.
These categories of suppression that we've noticed and other people have told us about. Well, first of all, sometimes they'll just acquire the technology. A front company will come in, offer the inventor a large amount of money, and the inventor says, and promises to bring it out to the world to save the world, so to speak. And so the inventor sells, sort of thinking that indeed this company will bring it forward and help solve the energy problem. In reality, it's often just put on a black shelf or buried away. It's the Indiana Jones scenario, the first Indiana Jones movie, where the Ark was just put into a giant warehouse full of cardboard boxes, and that was the end of it. Same kind of thing.
That's right. Well, recently, I think about 2 months ago, had a very close friend, a senior member of Congress, call us up, and explain that this person had been at Oak Ridge Laboratories there in Tennessee in a secret facility that was literally just like the Indiana Jones movie, that was filled with these kinds of new energy inventions that had been confiscated or bought out and then were being held there and put on a shelf. And they were ranged, some of them were many, many decades old and some were more recent. And again, this is a very serious person who is a close and intimate friend of a senior member of Congress who's a committee chairperson. And the kind of muscle and abuse of power that has gone into this is really breathtaking. And yet it's really a rogue and fringe element within the corporate and government complex, the sort of military-industrial corporate complex that is doing this, and they're doing it without the approval of the Congress or even the President of the United States. And yet no one seems to want to stand up to them because they have so much power and they tend to be so ruthless.
As I understand it, there are people within the Defense Department and the military who are desperate to get their hands on some of these technologies because they've been shut out just like the general public has been, and yet we're losing men and women in Iraq and other places around the world because we don't have some of these technologies, which would make their job so much easier and so much potentially life-saving of both the native populations as well as our own military people.
Well, yes, 3 or 4 months ago, I was at a meeting with several senior military people and a think tank that works very closely with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they are desperate to find these sort of technologies. And it's sort of surreal because then I will talk to someone who's a senior scientist at one of the most prestigious national laboratories in the Department of Defense, who will say, yes, we've built these things, but as soon as they get going, they get either confiscated or the funding is pulled. because we're successful in getting something like this operational, including anti-gravity, so-called anti-gravity or electromagnetic-gravitic systems. And yet you see other people who are sincerely hoping to find something like this. And so to say the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing is an understatement. In truth, the left hand doesn't know the right hand exists. And
so what you're
one
saying
of my jobs has been to provide this sort of information to the more enlightened and friendly leaders who are in Washington and in the Department of Defense, and say, look, this is this kind of chicanery going on, and this is what's possible, but you're going to have to be prepared to do some really heavy lifting and stand up to some enormously entrenched, powerful groups in order to make this change happen. And I'm reminded at Christmas, this past Christmas of 2007, I was invited to the University Club there near the White House in Washington for a tete-a-tete with a very big mover shaker who works very closely with the Bush administration and the nuclear industry. And, he said, the problem is the technologies you're talking about are too good. In fact, he says that is their problem. They would be the solution, and not just tinkering around squeezing 10% more efficiency out of gas or a little more efficiency out of coal or making
which is what we're doing now.
A little bit cleaner. It would be a revolution in energy, but it would also be a revolution in terms of the geopolitical control that's currently exerted. And that's one of the real fascinating dynamics that I've seen here. A lot of people say, hey, where's the beef? If this stuff was real, why don't we have it, sitting running our homes? And it's because the interests that want to keep these things out of the public eye are so powerful that they will do anything, and I mean literally anything, including buying them out and putting them on a black shelf, like you just mentioned, threats, intimidation, the misuse of the patent law, national security provisions, et cetera, and so on. The small inventor or scientist at a university who comes across such a energy breakthrough in no way is prepared for the huge buzzsaw they're going to go through as they try to move it from inception to the marketplace so that you and I have these things running our homes and cars. And that's where the problem is. That's where the OrionProject.org is key, because if people will help us, and we have a fundraising goal of around $3 million that we desperately are trying to get the public to understand how important it is to support this effort, to fund these sort of researchers under one roof and through grants so that we have a coordinated effort. That is so key, because right now we have found that so many of these inventors have worked as lone wolves, and they are very vulnerable to being picked off one at a time. But you know what? In numbers, there's power, and in unity, there's power. And if it's the old united we stand, divided we fall. If we can combine the resources of the public financially to support this research through the OrionProject.org, and then put this umbrella of protection and strategic connections that we've developed over the last 15 years around their breakthroughs, and also coordinate their research so that the insights of one inventor begin to really fertilize and cross-fertilize the breakthroughs of another, I think we're going to see some real magic happen very quickly. But that kind of thing has never happened. In 100 years, what has happened is that these breakthroughs happen, they begin to surface, and then they're decapitated or suppressed. And we have to change that dynamic so that we begin to have the real possibility of these earth-saving technologies and humanity-saving technologies begin to come out in a protected and orderly way. And we certainly have identified what I call the white hats who are in the public service in the Congress and in the Pentagon and elsewhere who would like to see that happen. But the question is, we're going to have to be the leadership entity. This is such a huge issue that you find most people, when they find out how large of an issue it is, they end up backing off of it. This is why Bill and Hillary Clinton, when we were in the process of briefing them on the UFO issue and why it was being kept secret. Well, the why is the same reason we're talking today. It's these energy and propulsion systems that are behind the UFOs. Obviously, they're not traveling through interstellar space using Exxon Jet A fuel. That when they
couldn't afford it.
When they realized that this was going to be a huge interest group, a very ruthless group that they would have to take on in order to make that happen, they basically said, we don't want to have anything more to do with this. And in fact, Hillary Clinton stepped in at the Rockefeller Ranch when Lawrence Rockefeller was putting these briefing materials that we had assembled and the cases we had assembled out in front of the President and the First Lady, and stepped in and said, we're not going to talk about this any further, and shut down the discussion. So what you find is that many of our political leaders don't have the courage to lead and do this. And many of the people who are in Congress don't know about these issues, and when they find out, they're intimidated. So really what's been lacking is a coordinated leadership effort by we the people who come together and say, all right, enough of this. You guys, you clowns up in Washington are, sitting on your hands, and even when you learn about this, you're not willing to do anything about it because you don't have the courage to do it. And now we have to do it. And I think that's why the OrionProject.org is so important, because it's really opened it up to where the public can support these inventors and researchers, and we can change this really dysfunctional dynamic that's been going on now for 100 years, where people like Nikola Tesla and Stubblefield have these amazing breakthroughs, only to have a J.P. Morgan confiscate it or suppress it or buy it out or threaten them. This sort of dynamic is gone over and over thousands of times, and we can document it and prove it. In fact, this research paper you're referring to, I think, is at the OrionProject.org.
Yes, I believe it is. And,
where it goes through the suppression and all the techniques and the individuals who have been suppressed.
Yeah, one of the techniques that they use that we haven't talked about, because it goes around to our leaders and believing this thing, is a combination of both the scientific establishment setting up a prejudice, and I was in academia for 30-plus years, right, in university-level research, and many colleagues just would not believe that there were alternative technologies that could save our bacon, so to speak. And so they would speak as a professor at XYZ University, and they would be speaking to the politicians and to the public, saying this is impossible. So it was sort of cut off at the very beginning before people could even look into it, because an established, shall we say, academic was stating that these things indeed were impossible. Furthermore, the major media in the country will pull in these experts to again say these things are impossible. So even a politician or somebody who wants to investigate or bring some of this forward has this incredible high road to walk and mountain to climb in breaking through all the prejudice, rejection of these technologies before they can even speak to funding them or getting people to listen to them. Very difficult task, and one thing we've observed in the Orion Project, of course, for years, and this is one aspect of our strategies, as you know, to sort of get around that or sort of break through that bottleneck in terms of getting the information being accepted.
Well, that's right, and I think a fairly recent example of this is a man I met with in Washington who's worked in government and in corporations all his entire adult life. He's an elderly gentleman, and he was working with a team that had developed Ken Shoulders charge, pulsed charge
cluster technology, yes.
And the charge cluster technology, not to get into a lot of physics detail, but basically they had found that it had an over-unity effect, meaning that it was creating more energy than it was taking to use it, but that it was also able to neutralize radioactive materials. And they first did this with low-level radioactive waste, and they had gotten a grant from the Department of Energy when President Clinton was president, and Bill Richardson was the head of the Department of Energy. And they actually met with Bill Richardson, the cabinet-level secretary of the Department of Energy, who said, this is exactly what we're looking for, because if this can be developed, we don't need Yucca Mountain. We don't have to be storing all this radioactive waste in the ground where it could rupture into the water table or...
Basically just neutralize it.
we can just neutralize it. We can do this and run it through a process where it becomes inert and neutralized. And this is really possible. We can clean up this mess we've created on this planet in the last 50, 60 years through the nuclear waste that's been created. And they actually issued a multi-million-dollar grant through a university working with this team because this effect had been replicated in Japan by an academic and a university. Well, Dr. Parks at the University of Maryland, who is one of the front people for this secret cabal trying to keep all these scientific breakthroughs quiet,
one of the academic
circled all
experts.
of his folks, and they barraged the Department of Energy with complaints saying that this is voodoo science, it's not possible, it's quackery. And they actually, after they even, this was a publicly published grant, they pulled it back and withdrew it. And that's the kind of effect. Now, what we have to do is create a public movement on the other side of this equation that says, wait a minute, here's the evidence. This deserves the support of the public and of research dollars and what have you. And so we're going to have to take a much more forward-looking, assertive position, because the other side of this equation has a very well-entrenched system in the corporate world, in the financial world, in these classified rogue military operations, but also within the scientific community that you're referring to, Ted. They have an extremely well-developed system to intimidate people just on the basis of bombast and attacks and ad hominem attacks to see that these sort of technologies are stopped. And so this is what we really, really have to address.
I might add that in terms of the academics, many of the academics have no idea that these technologies exist, have existed, and have been suppressed. And so when they speak about, oh, this is impossible, it's not that they're trying to hide it. They just don't know. And their foundation is in sort of basic textbook information. They don't know about this, shall we say, tier one science. And whereas there are people like Parks who do know and are doing that. His job is to keep this stuff under wraps.
Right.
But there's so many scientists that I ran into who were good scientists in a traditional sense, but really had no comprehension of these alternate technologies that could save our bacon. And so they would speak out as an expert, but they really were not. And that's part of the problem that we're faced with.
Right. And we're really talking about criminal enterprises here. I'm going to step into this a little bit and say we're talking about the largest racketeering influence corrupt organization, or RICO, on the planet, that has engaged in murder, mayhem, intimidation, abuse of power, all kinds of illegal activities in a concerted effort to keep these solutions off the radar scope of society so that we all stay addicted to oil and gas and coal and a centralized energy, and therefore a centralized petrodollar-based energy system. And you know what? We're really paying the price now. The dollar is collapsing. The environment is really strained. We're headed towards really big problems with China and other countries as we begin to compete for this shrinking amount of resources in oil and natural gas and other commodities. And this is all unnecessary. There's enough on this planet, if we use it wisely, to be here for thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. But we're not going to be able to do it by burning out of our tailpipes oil and gas and coal. And the solution isn't going to be a tinkering around the edges, increasing efficiency a little bit. It's going to be in bringing out these fundamental new sciences. And here's why. If we were to, all of us in the West, stop using oil and gas tomorrow, the effect of 2.5 billion people in India and China, that's 4 times the population of Europe and America, industrializing at 10 to 15% a year, the fact that they are putting online one new coal-fired power plant without any scrubbers a week in China, and a similar number in India. What this is going to do is the equivalent in the next decade of putting 3 billion Ford Explorers on the road all at once within the next decade. And so you cannot do that. So the basic paradigm of energy. The basic way that we're living on the planet is the problem, and tinkering around the edges and even saving 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50% isn't going to solve the problem. The thing that's going to solve the problem are these astonishing new technologies that get energy from the zero-point energy field or the quantum vacuum field that's all around us. It's estimated every cubic centimeter of space around us has enough energy to run the Earth for a day if we could tap into it. And what we're finding is that there are scientists over the last 100 years who have had that ability. There are some today who have some good understanding of it. But in order to put them together and make an actual product that you can use to run your home or car, that is a very big research and development effort, and that's why we are urgently asking everyone listening to this interview to go to the orionproject.org and support this research and make as big a contribution as you can, knowing what's at stake here.
Well, it has the potential. This has massive implications, and I think most people are becoming aware of this because they've seen the sticker shock at the pump. A gentleman by the name of Robert Hirsch, who is a senior advisor for SAIC, interestingly enough, just sat down last week, just a couple days ago, with MSNBC to discuss the possibility of the upcoming oil crisis, possibility of an upcoming oil. And he was saying that he expected gas to reach $15 a gallon within a few years.
Right.
Well, you say, oh my God, that's impossible. Well, people thought $4 a gallon was impossible. In England, right now, diesel is over the equivalent of $9 a gallon. And there was just a major truck strike or demonstration literally within today or yesterday. I'm not sure. I think it was today, actually, with the British driver saying, help, we need some help.
Right,
because we're going out of business. Now, he's talking about $15 a gallon gasoline within a few years.
Yeah, they're already
or more.
$9 a gallon now there.
Well, yes, and this Hirsch is talking about in the United States $15 a gallon within a couple years or a few years, quote. And my sense of thing is happening much more rapidly than anybody was predicted, and has to do with a lot of things, including agreed control, peak oil, and all the rest of it. And it's not that we don't have oil, it's that we have a declining amount of oil in a increasing market, and the curves are going in opposite directions. And as a result, the price goes up, and it's going up dramatically. And this will have, as you say, major impact. And I must admit, I have to laugh at the car companies who are saying that their next automobile will have 10% better gas mileage. Indeed, the price of gas is going up by factors of 2 to 3.
Right.
In the same time frame, they're coming out with maybe 10 or 15%. They're sort of off the trail. They're off the track totally. And so the energy-consuming public has got to have some options. And right now, what we're talking about here in terms of the Orion Project is looking at some options or alternatives to the present trends.
That's right. And I think the other thing that one of the things to share that's a very good news is, I wonder if you can speak about this a little bit, Ted, is this a recent project that the Orion Project.org is involved with and supporting, and there's been a very interesting and anomalous energy breakthrough within the last week on that. I wonder if you could speak about that.
We're talking. I believe you're talking about our pulse motor generator technology. Yes, we've been working. There are many scientists and engineers and inventors have worked on pulse motors, in which a tiny pulse of energy kicks a motor generator around, and if it's tied to a generator and by some very clever use of back EMF, and I won't go into technical details, it is possible to have the system run itself. And people say, well, that's impossible. It's a perpetual motion machine, and the academics are scratching their chins and pontificating. In reality, the magnets are providing the power, and ultimately the magnets will wear down. So you aren't getting something for nothing. You are using some energy from the magnets, but so there's a way of getting energy with one of these, quote, self-running systems. And we're working with a team right now that has been working on one of these systems for a while, and just this past week they had a situation in which they disconnected the battery that was in terms of charging, providing the pulses, and the motor sped up instead of slowing down. So there's some effects there that are exactly what they're looking for. But it's a research project, and it's going to be a while as they kind of go back and reprove it, redemonstrate it, reproduce it, and then move on to the next step of extracting excess energy from that process. So this is the kind of thing we're working on with the Orion Project, but it takes us basically slow, methodical, careful work by a team of engineers, in this case, both a mechanical engineer who knows mechanics extremely well and design stuff, and then an electronics person who can work on the electronics aspects. So one of the goals of the Orion Project is to bring in disparate experts with their own set of knowledge so they can work with others to sort of build more than an individual could do. There's a synergistic effect of having these people work together.
Right, and let me point out, so it makes it very real to the audience listening. One of these scientists and inventors is in Kentucky, and one is in New Hampshire or New England, and we're having to sort of fly the one to the other on a periodic basis because that's all we have the funding for. And if we had here near the University of Virginia in Charlottesville a facility, a permanent facility, properly equipped laboratory and fabricating equipment and the right oscilloscopes and what have you, where we could have a permanent core of 10 or 12 scientists and inventors working all the time and being able to share on a real-time basis their discoveries and findings and problem solving and problem shooting, we could collapse time frames and make it happen so much more quickly. But you can't do that without some kind of research and development funding. And all we're asking for is around $3 million in R&D funds to be able to do this for something that's really the most exciting technology and energy breakthrough sciences on the planet today. And this is why we're asking people to go to the orionproject.org, see what we're doing, and realize that this is not a pipe dream. These technologies exist and have existed, and in order to get them into the kind of state where they could actually run your home or run your car is a serious R&D project. You know, Chrysler spent something like $3 billion to just redesign the silly minivan. $3 billion in research funds. We're asking for $3 million, 1/1,000th of that amount, to come out with these fundamental new sciences and technologies that could transform the planet. And so we ask people to consider how they can help us and to let everyone they know. If everyone listening to this interview let 10 people in their network of friends and family know about the orionproject.org, we could raise these funds this summer and open this facility and really begin to take off with these technologies getting developed.
Absolutely, and just watching the two of these scientists getting together and spending 4 or 5 days together. I mean, the excitement of each one brought their expertise to the same location. And they spent, in fact, one of them was telling me, he said, in 5 days we put in 100 man-hours of discussion and experiments and measuring things. And so it's sort of a major leap forward, whereas an individual who doesn't know the half of the technology or doesn't understand it or hasn't studied it really is floundering without an expert by his side. And in this case, we provided the expert, and we're very excited about this because it's basically using our model of bringing in experts in a given area together to build a team that's much greater than the individuals in there. As I said, the synergistic effect of having the expert. And our model for the Orion Project is to do that. And
well, that's right. And, Colonel Brown, who had developed this, what he called a thunderstorm in a bottle, where he created this electrostatic charge in humidified air that caused this increase, this jump in efficiency of the internal combustion engine back some 25 years ago, he said that he had been pulled aside by a scientist connected to the government and said, you have stumbled across the tip of a very large iceberg. And we have since come to realize that the iceberg that he was talking about is the fact that people like Stan Myers and others apparently had been able to use a similar effect to completely dissociate hydrogen and oxygen from water using very low amounts of energy, so that you could turn your internal combustion gas guzzling car or SUV into something that's sipping on water and using hydrogen and oxygen through the engine, or a generator that would run your house from the wastewater you create from your showers and sinks. This is completely within the realm of possibility. Imagine, as a way of transitioning out of oil and gas and coal, what this would have, because we've already got 1 billion cars on the road, and we already have generators that are running, and that generator technology is perfected. And so these are technologies that we're also wanting to support. There's a man named Bob Boyce who has worked for years on this, and many feel he is someone who is very close to a big breakthrough, and we're investigating that his ability to take hydrogen and oxygen liberated from water to begin to run motors in cars, and to basically move forward the work that Stan Meyer, who passed away about 12 years ago, had done. So these are all things that if we could pull these sort of brilliant and innovative thinkers and scientists and inventors under one roof and have the kind of cross-fertilization but also support, because so many of these people will hit a wall with a technical problem and they're working by themselves in a laboratory or even in their garage, and they can't take it any further. But if we had a consultancy team, which we've identified, and then a core team working full-time, and this is what this budget, if you go to the orionproject.org, you'll see what the budget is for. It's a very, very practical undertaking, and it's completely doable, and that's why it's so exciting.
You know, it's very interesting. The two technologies that we've just talked about, in reality, are kind of a transition technology. They use existing, well, particularly the water-to-fuel issue that we're talking about, the Brown's gas or the hydroxy gas, of breaking apart water in a very highly efficient way to augment or to run generators, motors, on internal combustion motors on this mixture. But these are sort of transition technologies ultimately, and we've talked to people who have had these technologies, that we're ultimately looking for a technology that would be essentially a solid-state device. It would just sit there and through resonance processes essentially create electricity from the quantum vacuum state without any moving parts or adding water or anything else. But that's sort of a secondary thing. So we're working in the Orion Project. We're looking at all these levels of technologies. But one of the advantages or one of the issues that we see is that we want to be able to use existing infrastructure, in other words, generators and cars and what have you. We want to be able to use that because actually replacing all these infrastructure, such as all the automobiles in the country, would take 10 to 20 years at our present, or 10 to 15 years at our present production rate. Well, we need something that can utilize this infrastructure as these super alternate technologies come online.
Well, what we want to do is do both things simultaneously, and this is something that a lot of people haven't really thought about. It's that at the same time that we're creating a clean usage of the existing paradigm of internal combustion engines using things like this water-to-fuel system, we want to be creating these solid-state free energy resonance devices that eventually will be the power plant in your car and in your home to replace them. And we need to do both at the same time, because I think you're quite correct that if you had a perfected system sitting on your coffee table right now that would generate enough energy to run your home, to get that out to 6 billion people on the planet, or 6.5 billion people on the planet, or even to 120 million homes in America, it's such an enormous undertaking that isn't going to happen in 2 or 3 years. It's going to be a 10 to 20 year environmental Marshall Plan, I call it. It's a huge undertaking that will have to involve private sector, public sector, philanthropists, everybody. But to get to the point where we can even entertain that, we've got to get this research and development stabilized and protected, and also optimized by bringing these brilliant men and women together that we've met all over the world who understand these scientists and who could help develop a really robust system that would be putting out this kind of energy, or that would be perfected so that you could have a generator that would run your car or run the energy for your house from water, from the hydrogen and oxygen that's in H2O. And I think this is something that can happen and must happen. The question is, how is it going to happen? Many people have asked me, well, why don't you go ask Bill Gates for the funds? Or why don't you? And I said, I have met with more billionaires than you can shake a stick at. And they didn't get to be billionaires by being all that stupid. They don't want to shake up the system. And I remember there's a man who has 5 private jets and who has a personal income of $750 million a year. And Ted, you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, I do.
And we met with him. And this is an elderly gentleman, and he was very supportive of what we wanted to do. He actually helped provide some funding for the Disclosure Project. But when I asked him to put funding into these energy projects, he looked horrified and said, no, it's too dangerous, I won't do it. And then he told me this story, how he had known one of the senior executives of General Motors back in the 1960s, who told him that they had, sitting on a black shelf, a technology that would enable all the GM cars and trucks to use zero gasoline, and that this particular GM executive thought it was time to bring those out. Now, this was 40 years ago. He said 2 weeks later, this man was found dead of a, quote, apparent suicide, but he knew that it was not a suicide. The guy was not at all suicidal, that he had been killed and made to look like a suicide. So, this guy who is extremely connected up, I've been at his home. He has some pictures of him, on yachts with Ronald Reagan and the who's who of the world. And he says, nope, I won't touch it. Too dangerous. And so here's a man who, he has a whole fleet of private jets. His jet fuel bill would fund this project. No problem.
Without noticing.
But without without even missing it. But he's not going to do it. And so this is why we decided to form the the OrionProject.org, because the OrionProject.org is where anyone can go and give $10 or $50 or $1,000 or whatever, and by having thousands or perhaps even millions of people support this kind of research, it takes the weight and the attention off of one single financial supporter. And I think this is something people have to understand. Don't look around to your neighbor and expect them to solve this problem. We, working together in this state of consciousness and with the intent of creating a peaceful and sustainable world in the future, we can do this. This is what we can do. And it's sort of a passing of the buck to say, oh, well, aren't there a few high net worth people who will do this? My experience has been those folks want to protect what they got, and so they're not particularly great risk takers in this area. But those of us who are working in this, I'm happy to provide the leadership, as is Dr. Loder, but I think that the public have to understand that this change is going to have to come from the grassroots up.
Right, and as it does, and people, once, as I see it, once we have a breakthrough with a technology and people say, oh my gosh, there are some alternative ways to do things which are non-polluting, whatever, it'll be a waterfall and avalanche of these technologies, and we can sort of get off our present direction, which is not very good. Interestingly enough, Arthur Clarke, who just died recently, was talking about free energy many years ago, and he said it goes, the whole concept of what we're talking about goes through 4 stages of reaction, and to quote him, he said, the first stage is people say, well, it's nonsense, it can't be possible. And then when they sort of say it might be possible, they say it's not important. And then they say, oh, well, it was a good idea. And then finally the scientists will say, well, I thought of it first. So
right.
Sort of a humor.
I invented the internet and all that sort of thing, right?
Exactly. So there's an interesting set of stages, and we're really at the first and second stage of these technologies, where many scientists are saying it's nonsense. There's no possibility for any of this, or it's not important.
That's
and
right.
We really need to get to the point where people said they think it's a good idea, and it can start actually giving people hope for change in the future.
That's right. Well, and I think we are at the stage where we have seen enough. We know that this is absolutely feasible. This is not, an impractical pipe dream. However, to get it from the stage where we have seen people develop this to something that's actually going to run your house or your car is really quite a large undertaking of R&D. And the only reason we are confident we could do it with this $3 million in funding from the public is that there are 50 years of to 100 years of research that we have uncovered that could be brought to bear to, as it were, capitalize it. And so we're standing on the shoulders of those who've gone before us, and we've done our homework. And that's why it's so important to understand that in order for this to happen, we really just need this sort of like priming of the pump at this stage, because it's not like we're starting from zero. We're starting from 100 years of research that have gone into this, and 15, 18 years of research on our part of finding who on the planet who are living today understand these scientists, have had some breakthroughs that could be optimized and could be developed. And I think that we're at the point now where that's exactly the description, is that we're at this point where we just need the pump primed a little, and then it's going to run. And that's why now the public has to get involved, because I'm very skeptical that corporations or government or high net worth people are going to support this. I have not seen any evidence that they will. I do think, however, the public can learn about this. And that's why if people go to the orionproject.org and ask at least 10 of their friends and family to go there and learn about what the potential is with what we're working on and make a modest contribution, that we will have the ability to do this fairly quickly.
Well, we've already started the process. We know that the techniques and the process that we've set up to do this works. And we haven't. It hasn't finalized, but it does work in terms of our experience of bringing these people together. And so, as the contributions increase, and we can set up our own laboratory to do this, the increase will be dramatic.
Right, and by keeping people informed through the media and through the World Prugen Network and the blogosphere and the website. As we have breakthroughs happen, instead of it becoming something that withers on the vine that no one hears about, we'll get millions and millions of people to hear about these breakthroughs as they happen in real time, the day they occur. And this is one of the key points of our security program as well, is that you don't sit on this sort of information. You get it out to the people very quickly, because the people want this, and the people will fight to support it and to protect it. And we think that's very important in terms of overcoming the history of suppression of these sorts of life-saving and earth-saving technologies.
Yes, and this suppression has had a major impact, as I said earlier, on the inventors themselves, in terms of basically discouraging them. And if they can see that the information is getting out and there is public support, I think the number of inventors who have worked in some of these technologies and who've just given up by being depressed and what have you are going to say, oh my gosh, and I think we're going to see just this floodgates open of these different technologies. It's going to be incredible.
I think it's all ready to roll very, very quickly now, and it's just a matter of getting the public educated and supported for this. So that's what this is the challenge of the OrionProject.org, and we hope everyone listening will think about how they can participate in overcoming the bad karma of the past of suppression and create a new paradigm of disclosure of the truth and of supporting these technologies and getting them out and having them protected and supported appropriately, so that these courageous inventors who have hung in there sometimes for decades working alone in this field will now know that they have thousands or millions of people surrounding them and supporting what they're doing. Well, I think we're about out of time, but I would like to thank you, Dr. Loder, for joining us today.
You're welcome. A pleasure.
And I'd like to thank all of those listening. You've been listening to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer, and it's brought to you by the World Puja Network, and we very much appreciate the World Puja Network giving us the time to discuss these issues with you. Hope all of you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.